Hi, welcome to Lights Camera Author. I'm Jim Juno, and I have with me tonight an author who has a new book out. It just came out in July called The Naughty Bits, What the Censors Wouldn't Let You See in Hollywood's Most Famous Movies. Nat Segaloff is the author. Welcome back to the show, Nat.
Good to see you again, Jim. Looks like you're doing pretty well here.
I'm doing great. Thank you so much. And this book, I have read this book yesterday and today, and you've got some very, very famous movies on this list, but let's give a little bit of backstory first because we're talking about what is known as the Hays Code or the production code. And apparently, and I was reading your book, it's almost like 90 years ago this very month that it really came into force. I mean, it was there before it was there before 1934, but it wasn't really enforced truthfully. And for those of you who don't know, I'll let you explain what was the production code?
Well, a series of scandals in the 1920s in Hollywood, such as the death of director Thomas Ince, the drug overdose of star Wallace Reed, Mabel Normand, Fatty Arbuckle, all of these people grabbed headlines. There was a call for censorship of the movies, and the motion picture companies had joined together in an organization called the Motion Picture Producers and Distributors of America. And they were afraid that the creation of local censorship boards would mean they had to edit a different version of their movies for every town in America. So they used public relations and they hired a former postmaster general named Will Hayes, who looked like he fell out of a Grant Wood painting, to supervise the movies and make one central censorship office. And that was called the Production Code Administration. That was issued in 1930 with a list of what were called don'ts and be carefuls. That was a list of things that you shouldn't do in movies, or else you might run afoul of local censorship laws. And the problem with it was nobody cared. The producers and distributors roundly ignored it. And so we had some wonderful films as Gold Diggers of 1933 and The Story of Temple Drake and Babyface and Night Nurse, these just scurrilous motion pictures, which today are called pre-code films. They aren't really pre-code films, they're pre-code seal films, because in 1934, Hayes appointed a man named Joseph Ignatius Breen to head all of the censorship. And it's from about mid 1934 on that a film had to get a code seal if it could be exhibited in American theaters.
And Joseph Breen was the guy who really brought the hammer down. Well, and I can understand the origins of it because, like you said, the movies were their own worst enemy for a while there. But I mean, with Fatty Arbuckle and with William Desmond Taylor, Thomas Ince was
Yeah.
another one that comes to mind, and you know, and Wallace Reed, of course. The other, if you don't, if you guys out there listening and watching this don't know who those are, Google them. Okay, you'll find out why they are. But Fatty Arbuckle is probably the most famous one when he had those long three trials for rape and sexual assault, and you know they didn't do themselves any favors, did they?
No, not at all. And the problem, of course, was that the newspapers were able to sell more copies, especially the Hearst press, by banking on these people and the scandals. And they made the scandals even worse than they were with Arbuckle. He was acquitted after three trials, and the jury issued an apology. But his films were destroyed, and he couldn't get a job for the rest of his life. He did some directing, but he was ruined, and he was innocent. That's what
Yes.
happens. So the code was a reaction to all of that. And it became very, very, very serious. The problem with the code was that it couldn't change. It was set up by Breen and by Father Daniel Lords, by some of the same people who set up the Catholic Office of the Legion of Decency. And the code was established in quite some detail. And it stayed in force for decades. Even though America changed, the code couldn't. And that's the tragedy, because the big surprise I found in the book was reading about Joe Breen. He was a very intelligent man, extremely diplomatic, funny as all hell, and yet he was hamstrung by the severity of the code.
Then why couldn't it be changed? Was it, I mean, I know it was etched in stone, but why couldn't it be changed?
The motion picture industry was really like a lowest common denominator. Although the urban areas like New York, Chicago, and places like Los Angeles, San Francisco were very urbane and urban, the motion pictures were shown in the tens of thousands of theaters across the country, and the morals of the big cities were not the same as the morals in a small town. So they had to kind of average everything out so that the morals of the movies were pretty much consistent across the country. Besides, the people who made the movies didn't think they had to change. They instituted these rules and they kept them in place for so long until World War II came, Korea came, and the youth market came. And they realized that the code was outdated, but they couldn't change it because it was, as you said, etched in stone.
Yeah, and it reminds me a little bit of what MTV went through when they first came on the air. They didn't show black artists, and it was because, well, we have to program it for Kansas as well as New York, you know. And things do not change all that much in 50 years, it seems. Um, yeah, and there were, like you say, do's and don'ts. Some of the things I heard about the code, I was reading, and you list the code in your book at the end of it. But I didn't see some of the things that I've heard about the code, like kisses may not last longer than 3 seconds,
That's buried in
or
there somewhere. Yeah.
it is buried in there. Okay.
You couldn't show a toilet in the toilet.
Yes.
Things like yeah, I know very well the thing about kisses not lasting longer than 3 seconds. That's the story of my life. But as far as other things, you couldn't make fun of the clergy, of law enforcement, or politician. Boy, that's changed. You
Yeah.
couldn't show how crimes were committed, lest criminals be seeing the movies and learning how to rob a bank. You had to show twin beds, even for married couples, and somebody had to
One,
have a foot on the floor.
I
Right.
was gonna say 1 foot on the
Yeah.
floor, which
Now,
is
when I went to college, those were the rules, by the way, in the 1960s until we changed them. So these things were fairly pervasive. It sounds funny now, but when you think about it, the Motion Picture Production Code was really the first woke organization in America.
that's
And
right.
that wasn't a pejorative back in the 1930s, but now it's become one.
And you mentioned and you go all the way back. You go all the way back before the 1930s. You go before like even the turn of the century. You talk about Little Egypt, and if you want to see Little Egypt, you can do a YouTube search for her. She was a I would call a belly dancer, for want of a better term. I mean, it was by today's standards, yes, it's very innocent. But in 19, what was it, 1893? Is that what?
1896 at the Chicago World's Exposition. Yeah, she was a hoochie coochie dancer called
Yeah.
Fatima, Little Egypt. And she and her hoochie and her coochie just shimmied all over the place. And if she was fully dressed, you understand. But
Yes.
the morals of the day were such that she was considered shocking. I give some background as to where censorship in the movies came from. We also have The Birth of a Nation in
Right.
here, which now, of course, you can't show it without getting yourselves in a lot of trouble. But The Birth of a Nation was reissued in 1929 and 1930 when the code had just come into effect. And so that's why I put it in.
Right. And some of the things are even nowadays, in race in movies which deal with race, you could not, I guess you could use the N word. But I remember in The Heat of the Night, that movie with Sidney Poitier, it was told you can use it once or twice, but don't use it gratuitously.
Well, that was an important film in the heat of the night because Poitier wouldn't do it unless they had the slap, but unless they showed precisely how bad racism was. But even in something like Gone with the Wind, the book is full of the N word, but you couldn't say it. You could say something like darkies
Yeah.
in the Gone with the Wind. And in fact, the NAACP and some other African American organizations were consulted by David O. Selznick when he made Gone with the Wind to see just how offensive they could be. I think there's still a great deal that's offensive in Gone with the Wind, except perhaps to Clarence Thomas.
And you even get a foreword by D.W. Griffith.
Yes.
David Warner Griffith, I believe is.
David Warkriff had written a book when The Birth of a Nation was so roundly criticized, and he was about to film Intolerance, calling for freedom on the screen. And he purposely did not copyright it so that he could encourage other people to reprint it. Well, 110 years later, I'm reprinting it.
Now, a lot of the movies I've watched, I've seen there are a lot of them. I'm not going to pretend to say that I've seen them all or anything, but some of them, I love the things that got snuck by the code. or sneaked by the code, whatever. If my grammar is correct there. Let's talk about Bringing Up Baby with Cary Grant and with Katharine Hepburn, because this movie, even by the, I'm surprised it got a lot of things that got by. Um, and there's a famous scene. I'm not gonna. I mean, this is not gonna spoil the movie or anything, but there is a famous scene where Katharine Hepburn's dress gets ripped off the behind, ripped off her behind, so to speak, or so to speak. And Cary Grant, like puts his hat over her behind. That got through, didn't it?
That got through, but they were very concerned about it because they couldn't show skin, of course.
Right.
But see, comedies had a certain leeway that dramas didn't. Especially for Howard Hawks or later Billy Wilder, they could finesse things through, or Lubitsch could do it. But Bringing Up Baby had some problem. The thing that they missed in Bringing Up Baby was at the very beginning, if you remember, he's putting together a model of a giant brontosaurus, and his woman friend, his fiance, who's also his assistant at the Paleontological Museum, he's saying, "Where do I put this bone? Should I put it in the head or should I put it in the tail?" And she says, "Oh no, you tried it in the tail last time and it didn't fit."
Yes.
That's Think about that line.
And that is
It's
1933, I believe. I mean, that is,
seven, I think, sailed right past them.
yeah.
It's funny. Um, there was a movie called The Awful Truth with Cary Grant and Irene Dunn, which is about a
Mhm.
couple that gets divorced and they fall back in love again. And at the very end, and I don't know why nobody ever caught this, they're isolated in a cabin and they go into the bedroom. And at midnight, their divorce is going to become final. So they go away into the bedroom and then it's midnight and they're in bed together off screen. That's adultery, but the code didn't catch it. You see, there were letters written back and forth. Whenever a producer wanted to make a movie, they had to submit the story idea, the script, every version of the script, and quite often the cut and the final film and the trailers and the costumes and the lyrics to songs to the production code, who had yay or nay on every single stage. And they had a written correspondence to support this. So I was, thanks to the Motion Picture Association and the Academy, given access to thousands and thousands of letters between the studios and the production code, and managed to conjure out of it some of these amazing, amazing things that you never saw or that were changed when you did see them. That's what
Well,
the
there,
Naughty Bitch is about.
yeah, I mean, it's a fun read, everybody. I'm going to tell you that right now because it was a lot of the movies, and there was a couple of movies on the list that I was surprised you got on there. And um, now, The Sound of Music is the last movie I would have expected to make this list. Okay, I mean, and even you say it should come with a shot of insulin, you know?
There was nothing wrong with The Sound of Music, but like that in the Ten Commandments, it's sort of like trotting out the virgin at the vaudeville show in case the cops show up to bust it. You want to bring the clean act out. I wanted to show that the production code looked at The Sound of Music the same way they looked at every other film. And of course, it passed unscathed.
Oh, yes, indeed. And the movie Ecstasy on the other end of the spectrum. I imagine people had heart attacks when they viewed that one. This is a movie with Hedy Lamarr. And I know this is 1933
Yeah.
because I mean, and because I remember when TV, it was shown when I was in Louisville in the 80s, I believe. They finally showed it on a local TV channel. And they said, "Don't worry, you're not going to see anything." For those of you who don't know the movie, there's nudity in there and there's sex in there, and but anyway, the TV station said we're going to put a black bar over the screen. Well, when Hedy Lamarr came up topless, they put the bar up over her face, you know. So,
Oh gosh, that's wonderful. It's wonderful.
so, but yeah, and
It's
so,
a film about adultery and freedom and all that, but this is Hedy Lamarr made it when she was still called Hedy Keisler, and she was in Czechoslovakia before she'd been discovered and became an MGM star. Well, her husband later tried to buy up all existing prints, and there were people who had made copies illegally and hidden them away. The problem with the film wasn't just that it was a nudie, because that's a very small sequence. It's not terribly coherent, but it's not a bad film. It's that the American distributor tried many, many times to get it shown in America and to get a code seal, and they kept on changing the title and trying to flip it and confuse the motion picture censors. so that they eventually showed it, but under a different title, or they remade it, but it might have been the same film with the new title spliced on. I think it still hasn't been settled. So the chapter on ecstasy is more interesting for what happened to the film than for what happened to the content of it.
Exactly. I mean, it's like, and, and the other one of the movies that I didn't realize that they looked upon was when it came to World War II movies, Bridge on the River Kwai, and the best years of our lives. Those were movies that the times were changing after World War II, but the code wasn't changing. So there were things that they had to. I mean, the Japanese were not a well liked people in America after World War II. But you could not show still gratuitous killing of a Japanese soldier.
There was a great deal of concern that America would have peace at one point, and we didn't want to make too bad enemies of these of our enemies during World War II, and also the chronicle of racist portrayals of the Japanese and the Germans, but especially the Japanese, with the Coke bottle glasses and the buck teeth and all the mispronunciations. I mean, they were just not even funny at the time. They were. I mean, even Bugs Bunny did it in cartoons. You know,
Yes,
Bugs Bunny
indeed.
zaps the Japs and things like that. But look at it today, and it's really a shame. But they were the enemy. Okay,
Yeah,
that was what was going on in World War II.
and with Casablanca, with the Germans. Now, see, this is something they had to be careful with because they didn't want to lose the European market at first, right?
Well, at that point, I think Germany was pretty much cut off. The occupied
Right.
countries weren't renting American films anymore, but the Hollywood studios were very, very slow to take on the Nazis because they didn't want to lose this German business. Mind you, the studios were run largely by Jews, and talk about hypocrisy. Warner Brothers was the first when they made Confessions of a Nazi Spy because their sales manager in Germany had been beaten up and they had a vested interest in taking on the Krauts.
Yeah, exactly.
Eventually, everybody did.
The movies I see a lot of the same names popping up in these movies that you have on the list. One of them is Billy Wilder. Several of his movies are on the list. Some Like It Hot. Um, if I have to go through all of them real quick
Well,
here, but
Sunset Boulevard, not so much
Sunset
the other.
Boulevard, yeah. Uh,
Lost Weekend is the one that's amazing. Um, there was a prohibition against alcoholism in movies. Guess what the Lost Weekend is about? They literally didn't want the Lost Weekend to be about an alcoholic.
that's right
They
because
did manage to change that, though.
yeah, was it because they didn't want to lose the liquor sales? Is that something like that? It was a liquor lobby,
There
something.
was a rumor that the liquor lobby offered Paramount Pictures, who produced The Lost Weekend, a lot of money to destroy the film, and Paramount said no. There was concern because the liquor lobby then and now is very much concerned about responsible drinking. They thought this film violated that, despite the fact that it does have a sort of an uplifting ending. The thing they had to cut out of the film entirely was that the character played by Ray Milland, who was based sort of on the author of the book, was homosexual, and they could not
Yeah.
have that in movies. The production code called homosexuality perversion, sexual perversion, and any film that involved that, be it the Children's Hour or even the Peter Lorre character in the Maltese Falcon, they had to tone it way down.
And even like we were talking about Casablanca with Claude Rains' character. Um, wasn't in the book? Wasn't he like bisexual or I want to say he was bisexual or at least like a homosexual type of person.
No, he was just a Lothario. He was
Oh,
after
sorry.
all these women, some of them even underage, who were trying to get exit visas to get out of Morocco. He was the prefect of police, and he was the one who had to sign the exit visas. Well, he was not above um, essentially having the women prostitute themselves. I'm going to turn this down. Oh, it's a junk call. Um,
A
I'm
good old
getting more
spam,
junk than you can imagine.
good old
Uh,
spam likely. I remember him
yeah,
calling me every so often, you
right.
know. I
This
wonder
is
what
where
spam is up
Bakersfield.
to,
They
you
got
know.
enough problems. Uh, the Casablanca, the big problem was that Rick and Ilsa had an illicit affair.
Yeah.
Remember, she was supposed to be just a girl, Ingrid Bergman, right? And Bogart and Bergman were supposed to have an illicit affair at the time that she was still married to Victor Laszlo, but didn't know that he was still alive. The code was very, very clear about where to put the fade out and where to put the comments they had to each other. Casablanca, you wouldn't even think.
Exactly. I know. And then you have another name that appears several times on your list is Alfred Hitchcock.
Well, Hitchcock,
Psycho, Rope. I mean, yeah. I mean, it's. I mean, he pushed the limits big time, didn't he?
absolutely. In fact, he made a dare with the production code. They made him reshoot the opening of Psycho, which showed Janet Leigh and John Gavin in bed together. And they said, "You can't have this. They're not married. Look at they're in bed together." And Hitchcock says, "I'll tell you what. You send somebody over when we do the reshoots, and you tell us exactly what we can and can't do." They never sent anybody over. It went in the picture.
And also, I mean, in Psycho with I'm sorry, Rope. The two Leopold, who was based on Leopold and Loeb, if I can get
Yeah.
the words out here. The two characters there, they were more than just friends, weren't they?
No, they were lovers, and you
Yeah.
couldn't have that per se in any movie, let alone in a Hitchcock movie. But they managed to get away from it by not using terms like dear. Oh my dear. You couldn't say my dear because that was supposedly a homosexual expression. Little things like that, and the code picked it up in the script. This is a
Y-
script by Arthur Lawrence, so they had to change it. It was amazing they got anything done at all.
Charlie Chaplin even made the list here with Monsieur Verdot with, and like you said, you couldn't say the word dear. He in his movie he calls the character Monsieur Verdot calls a policeman, or I'm sorry, a priest, my good man. That got him in trouble for some reason.
Well, that was, yeah, I mean, that was certainly they were against Chaplin because of his politics. And I think they were looking for any reason to take the mickey out of him. He calls a priest my good man, and they said, "But you can't do that to a priest." And Chaplin said, "But isn't the priest a good man?" The thing that I think really pissed off the production code was that Chaplin just made his movie the way he wanted to. And only afterwards did he send all the paperwork in. He said, "I didn't know you had to submit things in advance." So I think they were giving him a large problem just because he didn't follow their rules. But it was, after all, about a serial killer, a
Yes,
French Bluebeard, a Landru, who would kill one woman after another for their money. That right away tempted the code, even though it was a comedy.
you have one movie that is beyond 1964, and that was in 1970. And if I can find which one it is now, because
I think we go up to Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf in 1966.
okay,
Uh,
what year was Tom Jones?
That was in the early 60s.
That was the early 60s. Okay.
You're giving me an oral exam, and I once I write the book, I just defrag my mind, and it goes. Tom Jones, of course, because it was ribald. Isn't that a
Oh
wonderful
my
word?
gosh. I
Ribald,
ribald, I know.
eating chicken parts and flinging them all over the place, and it was just something that they hadn't gotten used to. Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf was really one of the films where Jack Valenti, who was appointed to replace the guys at the production code in 1966, instituted something called SMA, which was suggested for mature audiences. That was the code's beginning to understand that there were people who were actually mature audiences and to restrict admission by children. Eventually, in the early parts of 1968, Jack introduced his letter rating system, which has changed somewhat over the years, but which is still in place. And in fact, the letter rating system has survived longer than the original production code.
That's right, because it had, I mean, you still have G. Well, you don't have PG anymore, or you have PG-13 or whatever
Yeah,
they
it was
call it now.
GP originally, general patronage.
GP.
Now it's PG, parental guidance, and PG-13, which I guess Steven Spielberg introduced for the second Indiana Jones film. They do assert, you see, the code is elastic now. And because it's elastic, any law that embodies the code, such as you can't show X-rated films in our town, because the code is elastic, a law can't be that indeterminate. So any law that quotes NC-17 or whatever is patently unconstitutional because it can't be vague. And that's what I think has frustrated a lot of people about the current rating system, is that you never really know how a film is going to be rated. And that's because the morals in America change, and the constituents who make up the classification and rating administration also change. And they keep the ratings fluent to reflect what's going on in society.
I don't want to get political here, but I remember what you're saying, though. I can see happening. I mean, in Louisiana, and then today, Oklahoma, you got to have the Bible and the Ten Commandments in public schools. And all of a sudden, I'm seeing the Legion of Decency starting to kick around in my head, going, "Are we on this road again?"
You know, the Legion of Decency was there to protect the Catholic faith from anything that might have taken away from it. They were not censors per se, the way the right wingers are in America now. Ordinarily, I'd say the Supreme Court has historically been in support of the First Amendment, but I don't think that's going to happen much anymore. So yeah, we're in a lot of trouble in America. But it's interesting now, again, going back to what's woke. Only movies used to be woke. Now Ron DeSantis in Florida and Rand Paul and others are accusing everyone else of being woke, and that's a bad thing. You know,
Yeah.
woke is supposed to be you're simply concerned about other people, but that's been changed so much politically to mean woke is being offended by everything.
Now,
Go
let me
figure.
ask you this. Let me ask you this. The with the code and well, the production code, Hays Code, it presented a challenge to the filmmakers. Were movies more creative, or I mean, how's that debate? Because that's a big debate. That these movies, they face challenges, but they overcame them.
That's the most astute question you can possibly ask, and thank you very much. You had to be more clever in those days. And you had to also be aware that there were some people in the audience who were more alert than others. You could have something in a film that would go over the heads of kids or unsophisticated people, but the older people would understand it and they would get it. That was the joy of movies. It's being able to go to several different audiences at the same time. And you look at some of the films, especially those in the naughty bits, these are classic films. These are films that have withstood the test of time for 50, 60, 70, 80 years. And there's a reason for that. That's because they appeal to different audiences in different ways. Nowadays, it's very different. People go to movies for different reasons, I think, not for general entertainment, but perhaps for distraction.
Yeah.
Anyway, it's just a thought as we hit the summary button. Movies are different these days. I kind of like the older ones, and at
Mhm.
least I can explain why.
You got enough for another book here. You could do a second Naughty Bits book.
The naughtier bits,
The naughtier bits. Yeah.
it's funny. There's a kind of a yin and yang thing. Uh, it's a book about the stuff that you don't see.
Yeah.
So go figure. Anyway, Jim, thank you so much for the chance to talk to you about this. I've had a ball talking to you.
Oh, thank you. The book is The Naughty Bits, What the Censors Wouldn't Let You See in Hollywood's Most Famous Movies. And the author is Nat Segaloff. Nat, again, thank you for being on Light Camera Author tonight.
My pleasure.